The envelope trembled in her hands before she even understood why her breath had stopped. Sarah Whitman stood frozen in the narrow hallway of her suburban Ohio home, the late afternoon light spilling across the hardwood floor, while the words on the paper burned into her eyes like a sudden verdict. The front door was open behind her, though she was sure she had locked it that morning, and somewhere deeper in the house a floorboard creaked, slow and deliberate, as if the house itself had just exhaled. In that instant, a question slid coldly into her chest without asking permission. What would you do if the safety you trusted vanished in a heartbeat? Sarah had lived alone since her husband Mark passed away 2 years earlier, taken by a sudden heart attack that left no room for goodbyes or unfinished sentences. Grief had reshaped her days into something quieter and heavier, and she had learned to survive on routine, faith, and the stubborn belief that goodness still lived in ordinary places. That belief wavered now as she clutched the envelope, addressed to her in uneven handwriting, demanding $20,000 by nightfall. Her knees weakened, not only from fear, but from the sheer disbelief that desperation had crossed her threshold. If you were standing there, heart pounding, mind racing, would you call for help? Or would you listen first? The man emerged slowly from the living room, careful not to startle her further, though his presence alone was enough to make her vision blur. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, with tired eyes that carried the weight of years gone wrong. His clothes were worn, his hands empty, and there was no weapon in sight, only a stiffness in his posture that suggested he was holding himself together by force of will alone. Sarah's thoughts screamed at her to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, yet something rooted her feet to the floor. Fear, yes, but also the unmistakable sense that this was not a moment meant to be escaped. The house intruder's gaze dropped to the envelope she held, then lifted again, filled not with menace but shame. He explained, haltingly, that his name was Matthew Brooks, that he had lost his job at a manufacturing plant in Indiana after an injury, that medical bills had swallowed everything he owned. His wife had left months ago, unable to watch him unravel, and his 7-year-old son now lived with a sister who could barely afford groceries herself. The $20,000, he said, was the only thing standing between him and losing what little hope he had left. Sarah listened, her fear slowly tangling with something far more uncomfortable, recognition of pain. Pain, she knew, did not always announce itself politely. It broke into lives uninvited, rearranged furniture, and left doors open that should have stayed closed. As Matthew spoke, Sarah saw flashes of her own past, the nights she sat alone after Mark's funeral, bills spread across the table, wondering how a life built so carefully could collapse so quickly. She remembered praying not for miracles, but for someone to see her, to understand that she was drowning quietly. Now here stood a man drowning loudly in her living room, and the question pressed harder. If compassion cost you safety, would you still choose it? Sarah moved to the kitchen table and sat down, her hands finally steady enough to lay the envelope flat. Matthew stayed where he was, as if crossing that invisible boundary would confirm every terrible thing he feared about himself. She asked him about his son, about what kind of father he wanted to be, about the night he decided to break into a stranger's home instead of giving up entirely. Each answer chipped away at the image of an intruder until all that remained was a human being cornered by circumstances he never imagined. The $20,000 was a number, but the despair behind it was immeasurable. Sarah owned more than Matthew could see. Years of careful saving, a life insurance payout she rarely touched, and a modest investment account Mark had insisted on building even when money felt tight. She had told herself she was preserving it for security, for the unknown future that frightened her more than the present. But sitting there, she realized security was not just about what you protected, but about what you chose to release. Her faith whispered softly, not with commands, but with reminders of mercy she herself had received when she least deserved it. She stood and walked to the small desk in the corner, the one Mark had used to write letters she never had the heart to throw away. From a drawer, she pulled out her checkbook, her fingers hovering above the paper as doubt and conviction wrestled in her chest. The number 20,000 seemed suddenly too small, too neat for the wreckage Matthew described. Without ceremony, she wrote a larger amount, one that made her pulse spike and her breath catch. It was more than pity, it was an act of trust that scared her almost as much as the open door behind her. When she handed Matthew the check, his composure cracked. His shoulders shook, his head bowed, and the tears he had been holding back finally spilled over, soaking into the paper like ink spreading across a page. Sarah felt her own tears rise, not from fear now, but from the rawness of the exchange. This was not charity wrapped in comfort. It was a leap taken in uncertainty. She told him to leave, gently but firmly, and to use the money to rebuild rather than disappear. He nodded, backing toward the door with gratitude written across every line of his face. After he left, the house felt different, quieter but not emptier. Sarah locked the door and leaned against it, sliding down until she sat on the floor, the weight of what had just happened settling into her bones. She did not know if she had done the right thing. She only knew she had done the honest thing. That night, she prayed longer than she had in months, not asking for protection, but for understanding of what kindness truly demanded. Weeks passed, then months. Life returned to its rhythm, though something inside Sarah had shifted, as if a window had been opened and fresh air was finally circulating. One afternoon, another envelope arrived, this one neat and carefully addressed. Inside was a letter from Matthew, written with humility and hope, explaining that he had paid off his debts, started physical therapy, and enrolled in night classes to train for a new career. He enclosed a photograph of himself and his son at a small park, both smiling with a brightness that felt earned. There was also a promise to repay every dollar, though Sarah smiled, knowing repayment had already come in another form. She realized then that the true shock had not been the intruder in her home, but the discovery of how much grace she still carried after loss. Kindness had not erased her pain, but it had given it purpose. And somewhere in that understanding was a quiet invitation for anyone listening to ask themselves what they might do when fear and compassion collide. Before the story ends, take a moment to reflect and share your thoughts in the comments below, because moments like this can mean different things to different hearts. If this story truly touched you, stirred something deep, or reminded you of the power of second chances, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing, so more stories of hope can find those who need them most.